6 weeks after Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was buried in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the High Court sealed her will. The date was May 17, 2002. The palace statement that followed was careful and brief. Her estate, valued at between 50 and 70 million pounds, mainly comprising the contents of her 3 residences, had been bequeathed in its entirety to her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. No inheritance tax was payable under a special arrangement negotiated with John Major's government in the 1990s that exempted sovereign-to-sovereign transfers. The statement said nothing about the overdraft. 6 years later, the Financial Times published an assessment drawing on William Shawcross's authorized biography. The official account, 1,100 pages, written with access granted by the reigning queen to her mother's private letters and diaries. The paper's finding was specific. The queen subsidized her mother and was reported to have paid off her overdraft at Coutts Bank after her death, a sum reputed to run into millions. The overdraft, the subsidy, the 50 years of financial accommodation the palace had arranged, sustained, and quietly absorbed. This is the account of how that happened and what it cost. The public image was enormous. That needs to be understood clearly, because the story only means what it means against the size of what the public believed she was. She had been photographed in the rubble of bombed East End streets. She had stood with her husband on the palace balcony while German aircraft flew overhead. She had refused to leave London, refused to send her daughters to Canada, and refused to abandon what she understood as her duty to the people watching. When Buckingham Palace was itself hit during the Blitz, she said something that would be reproduced on memorial programs and in official histories for the next 6 decades. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The initial East End visits had not all been warmly received. Her biographer records that rubbish was thrown at her early in the war because she wore expensive clothes that seemed to mock the deprivations around her. But her persistence and Norman Hartnell's deliberate shift to gentler colors and what he described as the rainbow of hope eventually produced the mythology that held. The wartime queen, resolute in the rubble. It was a construction, as all public images are, but it was built on genuine events and genuine courage, and it lasted. An Ipsos Mori poll from January 1994 measured her approval at 45% among the British public. Her daughter, the Queen, stood at 44%. This wasn't passive nostalgia. In 1992, the annus horribilis, 3 royal marriages collapsing simultaneously, Windsor Castle burning, the rest of the family had been losing public support at speed. At 93, she remained the most approved of senior royal in Britain. When she died on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor, aged 101, Parliament was recalled 4 days later. The House of Commons debated a formal motion, devoted public service to the country and the Commonwealth, and a unifying figure for Britain, inspiring love and affection in all she met. Her lying in state in Westminster Hall drew tens of thousands. One academic study of royal funerals described it as far larger in size and scale than comparable events. The love was real. The grief was real. The image was real. The Guardian, reporting the morning after she died on March 31, 2002, also mentioned something else. At one point, her overdraft at Coutts had reportedly reached approximately £4 million. The paper attributed a private remark to Queen Elizabeth II, supposedly made when the balance reached that level. "Coutts," she allegedly said, "would have folded long ago but for Mummy's patronage." That remark, if it was made, tells you something more interesting than the overdraft number itself. It suggests the daughter knew the scale, had known for a long time, was treating it as established, if absurd, fact rather than as a crisis, something long managed rather than recently revealed. The management had its origins in Parliament in 1937, when George VI was crowned in May of that year, unexpectedly after his brother's abdication. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Neville Chamberlain, moved the civil list resolution in the House of Commons. The King's annual provision was set at £410,000. The unusual thing, in retrospect, was how long the surviving went on. George VI died on February 6, 1952, aged 56. She was 51 years old, widowed after 29 years of marriage. When Chancellor R.A. Butler moved the new civil list resolution on July 9, 1952, an event recorded in Hansard at volume 503, the sovereign's provision was set at £475,000 per year for Elizabeth II, and a separate parliamentary annuity charged on the consolidated fund was established for the Queen Mother. That annuity grew across the following decades as the civil list was periodically reviewed. By 1990, Statutory Instrument 1990 number 2018, the Civil List Increase of Financial Provision Order, raised her parliamentary provision from £334,400 to £643,000 per year. The same statutory instrument raised the Duke of Edinburgh's annuity from £186,500 to £359,000. She was receiving nearly twice what Prince Philip received. Neither of them paid tax on these annuities. Average UK annual earnings in 1990 were approximately £11,000. Her provision was roughly 58 times that figure, paid annually from public funds, tax-free. Then, in 1994, approximately £19 million was separately set aside in a structured trust arrangement to support her household and expenses. The Telegraph's 2024 reporting, drawing on documentary sources, confirmed this figure. A trust of this scale requires legal structure, formal administration, and a clearly recognized problem requiring long-term address. By the mid-1990s, the gap between her official income and her actual expenditure had become sustained and significant enough to require not just informal family support, but a formally constituted financial mechanism. The provision, annuity plus trust, wasn't enough. By the end of the 1990s, the overdraft at Coutts stood at approximately £4 million. The annuity, the trust, the Coutts overdraft. These three figures, taken together, describe the financial architecture of a woman who received what most people would consider extraordinary public generosity and still required private supplementation on a scale that took institutional machinery to manage. To understand how the provision was outrun, you start with the decision she made in the weeks following her husband's death, a decision not to become what the Constitution said she now was. The widow of a king is constitutionally a queen dowager. It's a descriptive status, not a formal title conferred by ceremony, and it carries no negative connotation. It simply locates her precisely in the order of things, a former queen consort whose child now held the throne. Queen Alexandra had held the status throughout her son George V's reign. Queen Mary had held it through Edward VIII's brief tenure and the entirety of George VI's reign. Both remained senior, respected, publicly visible members of the family. The designation wasn't obscurity. She disliked it nonetheless. The court adopted instead a formulation unique in the history of the British monarchy. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The word queen was retained. The word mother distinguished her from her daughter. The word dowager didn't appear. At her funeral on April 9, 2002, the Garter King of Arms proclaimed her full constitutional status for the public record, because protocol required it. Both titles together, because constitutionally both had always been accurate. But for 50 years of her widowhood, The public formulation had contained only one of them. The practical effect was that she was treated, in every ceremonial dimension, as a senior queen rather than a former one. Foreign heads of state called it Clarence House rather than the palace, paying court to a constitutionally retired consort, as if she still held an active role, because the formulation she had insisted upon implied that she did. The household she ran for 50 years reflected that self-understanding. Clarence House, built in 1825 to 1827 by the architect John Nash, became her primary London residence in 1953, shortly before the coronation. She made it properly hers. The house was furnished and hung across nearly 5 decades with artworks she had spent those same decades acquiring. She held luncheons and evening receptions at Clarence House continuously until close to the end of her life. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park served as her Windsor residence for the same period, a Crown estate property, meaning it was never privately owned, but used under a grace and favor arrangement for the full half-century of her widowhood. After her death, Prince Andrew assumed a 75-year lease at a token annual rent, paying a £1 million premium and taking on responsibility for substantial renovation costs. Property experts subsequently estimated the annual running cost for Royal Lodge at £4 to £5 million per year in the years that followed. The Castle of May, on the northern coast of Caithness in Scotland, had a different origin. She spotted it in 1952, near derelict, behind a grove of coastal trees twisted by persistent Atlantic gales, while visiting friends shortly after her husband's death. According to the biographer Sally Bedell Smith, drawing on the account of the Queen Mother's first cousin, Margaret Rhodes, "How sad it looks," she said, "just like me." She bought it for a token sum of approximately £100. The Queen Mother used her own funds to bring the castle up to date, adding electricity and fresh water supplies. She visited for approximately 2 weeks each year. After her death, it was placed in a charitable trust and is now open to the public. 3 properties, simultaneously maintained. By 1971, the parliamentary record was specific enough to count. During a House of Commons debate on the civil list, the Labour MP Willie Hamilton, a persistent and well-sourced critic of royal expenditure, listed 33 named officers of the Queen Mother's household as a point of public scrutiny. Those were the named officers, the senior tier. The full complement, social secretaries, ladies-in-waiting, equerries, footmen, cooks, chauffeurs, gardeners, grooms, was larger. Biographers from 3 separate research traditions, working from different sources and different access arrangements, reached the same description. A household operating at court-like scale, consistent with her status as a former reigning queen rather than a pensioned widow. Her biographers are also consistent on one other point. A biographical account drawn from the household records states that her lifestyle in 2000 was fundamentally the same as it had been in 1930. In 1930, she was queen consort, wife of the king, funded by the civil list at palace scale. In 2000, she was 99 years old, widowed for 48 years, drawing a tax-free parliamentary annuity and managing the overdraft at Coutts. The lifestyle had not changed. The constitutional position had. Into that lifestyle fed several overlapping categories of spending, each documented to different degrees. The alcohol consumption was the most publicly characterized by household accounts. In 2008, Riemann Danzy Auctioneers sold a collection of the Queen Mother's personal effects, memorabilia belonging to her long-serving page, William Talon, who had entered royal service in 1951 and remained with her until her death. Among the items was a handwritten note in which she asked an aide to pack gin and Dubonnet for a holiday trip. The note sold for £16,000. The daily routine attributed to her across multiple household accounts, Dubonnet and gin before lunch, wine with meals, a martini before dinner, champagne in the evening, was described consistently enough by those at Clarence House to be treated as documented household practice rather than anecdote. Tom Quinn's biography of Talon characterized the consumption as a recurring, documented feature of the household's daily rhythm. Buckingham Palace, in 2014, pushed back on the most extreme characterizations, specifically the suggestion that she was drunk and dotty for the last 2 decades of her life, a claim Margaret Rhodes rejected. But the existence of a substantial, sustained alcohol budget isn't in serious dispute. The art collecting was more expensive and better documented. The art newspaper, in February 1997, assessed her as the most important royal collector since the early years of Victoria's reign. Her collection was largely invisible to the public because it was held at a private residence, Clarence House, rather than on public display. But it was substantial, assembled across 60 years of commercial transactions with dealers, galleries, and auction houses. It eventually formed a major part of the gross estate that Buckingham Palace valued at between 50 and 70 million pounds. But building it had required money going out for 6 decades, feeding into accounts that weren't always covering it. The horse racing commitment was where the official biography most directly connected the passion to the deficit. Her involvement in national hunt steeplechasing was lifelong and financed at scale. The Queen Mother Champion Chase, currently a Grade 1 steeplechase at the Cheltenham Festival, the feature race on the second day with a 2025 prize fund of £400,000, was established in 1959 as the National Hunt 2-Mile Champion Chase and renamed in her honor in 1980, her 80th birthday year, in recognition of her decades-long support for jump racing. She owned national hunt horses across decades, and the financial commitment that ownership requires was substantial. The Los Angeles Times, reviewing Shawcross's official biography on October 19, 2009, was specific about how the biography handled the connection. Her spending was cheerfully vast. The overdraft ran to reported millions, and the biography linked the pattern to her passion for racing and betting. This isn't tabloid characterization. This is a named publication, on a named date, reviewing a 1,100-page authorized account written with access to private letters and diaries, commissioned by the reigning queen. It's the clearest documented connection in the public record between the racing interest and the structural financial deficit. The Financial Times in 2008 added a crucial temporal dimension. Shawcross's research had found documentary evidence of a cash crisis around 1959, within 7 years of George VI's death. Official correspondence and civil list discussions at the time had captured it. The financial problem wasn't a development of old age or declining health. By the time she was in her late 50s, the spending was already outrunning the income to cover it. Whatever accumulated over the following 4 decades built on a foundation that was present almost from the start of her widowhood. By the end of the 1990s, the accumulated negative balance at Coutts had reportedly reached approximately £4 million. The Guardian reported this figure the day after her death. The Financial Times confirmed the scale in 2008. The Telegraph cited the Coutts overdraft in its September 2024 coverage. Higher figures, $7 million, $8 million, circulate in secondary sources and social media without primary source backing. The consistently cited figure across serious outlets is approximately £4 million. The palace has never confirmed or corrected it. The clearest statement of what Elizabeth II had done about it came from the Financial Times in March 2008. Shawcross had documented 2 distinct operations. The Queen subsidized her mother and was reported to have paid off her overdraft at Coutts Bank after her death, a sum reputed to run into millions. A subsidy during life, a specific post-mortem clearance of the Coutts account. 2 things. The 1994 trust, the £19 million set aside to supplement the annuity, provides the institutional context for the subsidy during life. By the mid-1990s, the gap had become chronic enough and large enough to require formal legal structure. A trust requires administration, a named trustee, a legal instrument. This wasn't a daughter quietly writing personal checks. This was an institutional response to an institutional problem. What isn't publicly documented is the specific mechanism of any particular transaction. No named private secretary has described a specific bank instruction. No Coutts document is in the public record. What serious reporting consistently describes, across the Financial Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and the authorized biographies reviewers, is the pattern: subsidy during life, overdraft clearance at death. The machinery of how it worked is private. That it happened is documented. The framing matters enormously. Elizabeth II wasn't naive. She wasn't a passive bystander. She was the head of an institution whose entire public value rested on its reputation, and her mother's financial situation was a reputational liability attached directly to the crown. An uncontrolled disclosure, through debt recovery action by a creditor, through court proceedings, through any mechanism other than controlled palace management, would have been damaging not just as personal gossip, but as institutional fact. Here is what happens inside the monarchy's finances when nobody is looking. She paid because the cost of paying was lower than the cost of not paying. She was managing a liability with her mother's face on it. That isn't weakness. It's the cold, clear logic of institutional reputation management, applied by a woman who had been running that institution for 50 years. There is a detail from the accounts of their Sunday routines that sits quietly alongside the financial picture. After church at Windsor on Sunday mornings, Elizabeth II would call on her mother at Royal Lodge. The biographer's description is specific about one thing: she always slipped in the back way to avoid upstaging her. The reigning monarch going through the back entrance of a grace and favor property so that the Queen Mother could remain the central figure of her own domestic domain. The financial subsidy and the back entrance visits were expressions of the same calculation. The arrangement had to be sustained, and sustaining it required deference. The question of who else bore any part of the weight is harder to answer with precision, and it deserves that precision. Stories circulate widely, in popular commentary, in YouTube documentary content, in social media, of London florists, wine merchants, and local tradespeople left unpaid by the Queen Mother's household, too intimidated to pursue collection from the mother of the sovereign. Coutts & Company is the only specifically named creditor in serious reporting. The anecdotal accounts of unpaid small suppliers are plausible, given the documented financial behavior, but they are anecdotal. No named tradesperson, no specific business, and no quantified commercial arrears to any creditor other than Coutts appears in the public record. What can be stated is the structural reality. The Queen Mother wasn't covered by the sovereign immunity that would have protected Elizabeth II from civil action. That immunity applies to the reigning monarch as head of state, not to former consorts. She could, in legal theory, have been sued for unpaid commercial debts by anyone to whom she owed money. In practice, any supplier considering debt recovery action was weighing something deeply asymmetric: the amount owed on one side, and on the other, the reputational and commercial consequence of being seen to take the mother of the Queen to court. The practical deterrent was real, even without the legal one. What official records do confirm is that the breadth of her financial claims on public funding extended well beyond the headline annuity figure. A 1960s government memorandum, reported by The Independent in August 2002, recorded Treasury officials balking at items being put through on the Queen Mother's expenses. The examples cited included royal haircuts and clothing. The friction was internal: civil service pushback at the granular level of individual expense categories. It didn't generate public scrutiny. It was absorbed, as everything was absorbed, within the machinery of the institution. The Art newspaper's 1997 assessment, the most important royal collector since Victoria's reign, implies decades of commercial relationships with dealers, galleries, and auction houses conducted at scale. The Cheltenham racing interest implies decades of financial commitment to stables, trainers, and the broader infrastructure of national hunt ownership. The 3 residences, the 60-year collecting career, the court-like household. These aren't abstractions. They are systems of commercial activity, requiring suppliers who provided goods and services in exchange for payment. Who those suppliers were, what they were owed, and whether they received it in full and on time are questions the sealed will and the absent public probate accounting can't now answer. On March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park, she died in her sleep. It was the Saturday of Easter weekend. She was 101. Her younger daughter, Princess Margaret, had died 6 weeks earlier. Elizabeth II was reported to have been at her bedside. Parliament was recalled on April 3rd. The House of Commons debated the formal motion of condolence. The Speaker recorded the exact terms: devoted public service to the country and the Commonwealth, and a unifying figure for Britain, inspiring love and affection in all she met. Members spoke. The motion passed. Her coffin was moved to Westminster Hall on April 5th, lying in state until April 8th. The funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on April 9th, 2002. The Garter King of Arms proclaimed her full titles. She was interred at St. George's Chapel alongside her husband. On May 17, 2002, the High Court sealed her will. This is, to be accurate, standard procedure for senior members of the royal family, not uniquely suspicious concealment, but the application of an institutional convention that is routinely applied. The effect of that routine convention is that no public probate accounting was required of an estate that had been carrying a several £1 million negative cash balance at a private bank for the better part of a decade. On May 18th, Buckingham Palace issued its statement. The estate, primarily the contents of her 3 houses, was valued between £50 and £70 million gross and bequeathed entirely to Elizabeth II. No inheritance tax, under the arrangement with Major's government. The statement was brief and contained no reference to the Coutts balance, the trust fund, the subsidy, or the post-mortem clearance. The Financial Times published its account 6 years later. The Telegraph mentioned the Coutts overdraft in its coverage of her financial history 22 years after the will was sealed. The ledger, officially, remains closed. What the evidence establishes, stated plainly, is this. She received a tax-free parliamentary annuity confirmed by statutory instrument at £643,000 per year by 1990. She received a supplementary trust structure of approximately £19 million, established in 1994. She maintained 3 residences and a household. The 1971 parliamentary record counted at 33 named officers. Her official biographer, writing with access granted by the reigning queen, documented spending that the Los Angeles Times called cheerfully vast, with reported millions in bank overdrafts linked to her passion for racing and betting. The Guardian's review of that same biography described her as deeply in debt most of her later life. Her overdraft at Coutts reached approximately £4 million by the end of the 1990s, reported by The Guardian the day she died, and confirmed by the Financial Times drawing on Shawcross. Elizabeth II subsidized her mother during her lifetime and cleared the Coutts overdraft after her death. The will was sealed. The palace statement enumerated the assets. No official accounting of the liabilities has entered the public record. The gross estate was substantially larger than the overdraft. She wasn't insolvent in any conventional sense. She was asset-rich and chronically cash flow negative, holding tens of millions in paintings, furniture, jewelry, and the accumulated contents of a 60-year collecting career, while running a negative balance at her bank that had required both an ongoing subsidy and a post-mortem payoff to manage. The assets passed to her daughter. The debt passed to her daughter. Both did so through mechanisms specifically designed to keep the detail from public view. The system that made this possible wasn't accidental. A parliamentary annuity, set by statute, revised by statutory instrument, paid tax-free. A private trust, formally structured, supplementing what the annuity couldn't cover. A private bank, Coutts, the bank of the royal family, discretion its primary product, accommodating the overdraft without pressing for settlement in ways that would generate external scrutiny. A daughter with both the resources and the institutional incentive to intervene when the balance went too far wrong. A will, sealed by the High Court on the standard schedule for senior royals, eliminating the public probate accountability that would apply to any ordinary estate. And a public image, 65 years of it, built on the wartime courage and the East End visits and the balcony appearances and the approval ratings, robust enough to absorb whatever seeped into the press without disturbing the overall picture. That image wasn't dishonest in its origins. The courage was real. The wartime solidarity was genuine. The public love that greeted her lying in state was real. But the image also performed a specific institutional function across the decades. It made the financial reality difficult to discuss. To raise questions about the spending was to seem to be attacking a national symbol. To point at the overdraft was to seem to be picking over a grandmother's finances after her death. The image protected the ledger. The ledger was protected by the image, and the palace ensured the two never had to confront each other in public. She continued to live as if she were still queen, in her household scale, in her staffing, in her 3 residences, in the deference she received and the back entrance visits her daughter made to preserve it, because the system surrounding her treated her as if she still were. The parliamentary annuity reflected that. The trust fund reflected that. The Coutts overdraft reflected that. The post-mortem clearance reflected that. The nation's grandmother. The monarchy's most sustained financial open secret. Both things at once, for 50 years, with a wall between them that held until after the funeral was over, and the ledger was sealed. Subscribe for more stories like this.